October 14, 1884, arrived with a deceptive, bone-dry stillness that signaled a brutal shift in the high Sierras, a temperature drop that would leave the unprepared shivering in their blankets before the moon reached its zenith. Thomas stood on the uneven porch of his cabin, watching a hawk circle the gray granite peaks, his breath already beginning to plume in the sharpening air. Beneath the heavy floorboards where he stood lay a secret that the rest of the settlement in the valley below considered a fool's errand, a subterranean cavity hand-dug through shale and clay that most men would have deemed too stubborn to move. To any rider passing by on the trail, Thomas was simply a solitary widower living in a modest, perhaps even drafty, timber frame that looked ill-equipped for the Sierra snows that were famously capable of burying a house to its chimney. They saw a man whose wife had passed 3 winters ago and whose children had never been born, leaving him with nothing but a stubborn streak and a shovel. What they did not see was the 3 cords of seasoned cedar and oak tucked neatly into the darkness of the crawl space, kept at a constant, earth-insulated temperature and shielded from the coming wet by a clever system of drainage trenches he had spent the entire summer perfecting. He knew the valley men would soon be struggling with top-covered piles that would inevitably soak through when the sleet turned to ice, but Thomas had built himself a bank of heat that no storm could touch. He wouldn't learn for weeks just how many of those neighbors would come knocking when their own hearths went cold, but for now, he simply felt the weight of the coming frost and knew his foundation was solid. The real test was not the first dusting of white, but the sustained, weeks-long freeze that turned wood into iron and hope into a scarce commodity, and Thomas had prepared for exactly that. He adjusted his coat, feeling the stiffness in his joints that matched the hardening ground, and looked toward the trail where the first skeptic of the season was already beginning his ascent, unaware that the very ground beneath Thomas's feet held the difference between a comfortable winter and a desperate struggle for survival. The origin of this labor had been a wet, miserable Tuesday in March of the previous year, a day when the rain had turned the valley into a soup of mud and the wood Thomas had thought was dry hissed and sputtered in his stove like a dying animal. He had spent that afternoon shivering in a damp wool coat, realizing that the traditional method of stacking wood against the exterior wall or under a simple lean-to was a failure of design when faced with the horizontal driving sleet of the high country. It was a moment of clarity born from physical discomfort. He looked at the space beneath his cabin, a wasted gap of shadows and damp earth, and saw a solution that ignored a century of frontier habit. Most men built up, but Thomas decided he would build down, utilizing the thermal mass of the earth to keep his fuel from freezing and the shelter of his own floor to keep it dry. He began the work in the thaw of April, moving stones that weighed as much as a small calf, his hands becoming a map of callus and scars as he fought the mountain for every inch of depth. He didn't use a team of horses or a crew of laborers, partly because he had no money to spare and partly because he didn't want the unsolicited advice of men who thought they knew the mountain better than the mountain knew itself. Every bucket of dirt he hauled out was a silent protest against the way things had always been done, a slow and methodical reclamation of space that would eventually house his survival. He measured the clearance with a notched stick, ensuring there was enough airflow to prevent rot but enough enclosure to trap the earth's natural warmth, a balance that required him to crawl on his belly in the dark for hours at a time. By the time the wild roses were blooming in the meadows, he had a cavern 4 feet deep and 12 feet wide, a hidden fortress for the only currency that mattered in the winter, dry, combustible fiber. He knew the neighbors thought he was losing his mind, watching him disappear under his house day after day with a lantern and a pickaxe, but Thomas had stopped caring about the opinions of the valley long before his wife's headstone had settled into the grass. He was building a bridge to next spring, 1 stone and 1 shovelful at a time, and the blueprint was etched into his mind with the permanence of a debt. As the structure of his underground shed took shape, Thomas began to notice a detail that everyone else in the settlement seemed to overlook, the way the mountain's runoff carved predictable channels through the topsoil during the heavy rains. While his neighbors were busy cursing the mud in their yards, Thomas was studying the pitch of the land, realizing that if he didn't divert the subsurface moisture, his hidden woodpile would become a subterranean pond. He spent 3 weeks digging a perimeter trench lined with smooth river stones he hauled up from the creek, creating a French drain that would catch the water and usher it safely around his foundation. It was a secondary layer of protection that looked like nothing more than a shallow ditch to the casual observer, but to Thomas, it was the lungs of his project, allowing the earth to breathe without drowning. He watched the way the wind whipped around the corner of his cabin, noting that the north side stayed frozen longer, and adjusted his ventilation slats accordingly, using salvaged scrap lumber to create a baffled airflow that would pull moisture out without letting the snow drift in. He was working with constraints that would have defeated a less patient man: scarcity of materials, the physical toll of his age, and the constant, nagging pressure of the calendar. He didn't have the luxury of a sawmill or a hardware store. He had a draw knife, a crosscut saw, and a sense of geometry that he had refined over decades of making do. He calculated the weight of the wood he intended to store, reinforcing the floor joists of his cabin with extra piers made of stacked flat rock, ensuring that the added burden wouldn't cause his home to sag or buckle. It was a delicate dance of engineering and sweat, a series of small, calculated risks that all pointed toward a single goal: a fire that would catch on the first match, no matter how hard the blizzard howled outside. He was not just stacking wood, he was building a machine made of oak and gravity, a system designed to exploit the very environment that tried to kill him every December. The planning phase was a quiet obsession, a period of intense observation where he learned to read the mountain's intentions before it acted, a skill that the younger, faster men in the valley had never bothered to develop because they still believed in the primacy of muscle over method. The execution of the plan was a montage of rhythmic, exhausting labor that defined the hottest months of the summer, a period where Thomas became a ghost in his own yard, visible only when he emerged to stack the freshly split logs. He had a ritual, felling the trees in the early morning before the heat became oppressive, backing them into 16-inch lengths, and then splitting them with a heavy maul that felt heavier with every passing year. Each log was then carried, 2 at a time, to the opening he had cut into the skirting of his cabin, where he would slide them down a wooden ramp he'd built for the purpose. Once inside the cool, dark space, he stacked them with a precision that bordered on the fanatical, leaving exactly 2 inches of space between the stacks and the dirt walls to ensure that air could circulate. He worked until his shirt was translucent with salt and his back felt like a piece of scorched leather, but the sight of the rows growing higher gave him a satisfaction that food or rest could not provide. He counted the logs as he went, translating the numbers into nights of heat: 40 logs for a week of moderate cold, 60 for a deep freeze, 1,000 for the whole season. He was building a physical representation of security, a tangible hedge against the unpredictability of the frontier. The work was repetitive, a cycle of lift, carry, slide, and stack that stripped away everything but the essential mechanics of survival. He didn't think about his loneliness or the silence of the house above. He thought about the grain of the wood, the smell of the drying sap, and the way the stones of his drain clicked together when he stepped on them. He was a man becoming part of his own machine, a gear in a system of his own making, and the progress was measured in the shrinking pile of raw timber and the growing wall of fuel beneath his feet. By August, the space was half full, and the air inside the crawl space smelled like a forest in autumn, a rich, resinous scent that promised safety. He knew he was ahead of schedule, but he didn't slow down, because the mountain had a way of stealing time when you least expected it, and Thomas was determined to have his bank full before the first goldenrod withered in the frost. The first of the skeptics arrived in late August, a man named Miller who owned the largest spread in the valley and prided himself on a brand of practical experience that usually involved telling other men why they were wrong. He rode up on a chestnut mare, leaning over his saddle to peer at the dark opening beneath Thomas's porch with a look of profound pity. "You're going to rot your floorboards out, Thomas," Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who hadn't swung an axe in a decade but remembered the theory of it. "Wood needs the sun to dry, and you've gone and buried it in the dark like a coffin. You'll have mushrooms growing in your parlor by Christmas, and that wood will be too soggy to light a pipe with, let alone heat a house." Thomas didn't stop his work, he simply reached for another log, his movement steady and economical. "It's drier down there than it is in your barn, Miller," Thomas replied, his voice level and devoid of any defensive edge. "The earth stays 50 degrees, and my trenches keep the floor bone dry. It's not buried, it's insulated." Miller let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as he adjusted his reins. "Insulated or not, you're fighting nature, and nature always wins. I've got my wood stacked 6 feet high against the south fence, catching every bit of sun. That's how my father did it, and that's how a man stays warm. You're just making a home for the rats and the damp." Thomas paused then, looking up at the wealthy rancher with a dry, tired smile. "Your father didn't live at 7,000 feet, Miller. And your fence won't stop the sleet from turning your pile into a block of ice come January. I'd rather be a fool in a warm house than a traditionalist in a cold 1-inch." Miller scoffed, spurred his horse, and headed back down the trail, leaving Thomas in the settling dust. It was the first of many such visits. The local blacksmith would soon come to question the structural integrity of the piers, and the circuit rider would eventually suggest that such an obsession with the earth was unseemly for a man of faith. Thomas listened to them all with the same quiet detachment, knowing that their objections were based on a world that didn't exist up here on the ridge. He wasn't building for their approval, he was building for the moment the thermometer broke and the world turned white, a moment he knew was coming as surely as the sun set behind the peaks. The technical skepticism arrived in September in the person of Henderson, a man who had spent 20 years as a master carpenter before the mountain air called him to a quieter life. He didn't come to mock, he came to inspect, walking around the perimeter of the cabin with a critical eye that missed nothing. "The weight is the problem, Thomas," Henderson said, tapping a structural beam with the back of his hammer. "You've got 10, maybe 12 tons of green turning dry wood sitting on a slope that wants to slide. You're asking these stones to hold up the fuel and the house, and when the ground saturates in the spring thaw, the hydrostatic pressure is going to kick your foundation walls right into the center of your cellar." Thomas wiped his brow and pointed toward the corner where his stone drain disappeared into the brush. "That's why the trench goes 3 feet deep and is backfilled with river rock, Henderson. I'm not letting the pressure build, I'm giving the water a path of least resistance that doesn't involve my walls." Henderson knelt, peering into the dark gap with a lantern, his face a mask of professional doubt. "It's a clever bit of digging, I'll give you that, but wood expands and contracts. You've packed it tight against the joists. One good swell and you'll pop the nails right out of your floor." Thomas didn't argue the physics, he simply showed Henderson the half-inch gap he'd maintained at the top of every stack, a breathing room that accounted for the very expansion the carpenter feared. Henderson grunted, a sound that was half concession and half warning. "You're a meticulous man, I see that. But the mountain doesn't care about half inches when the frost heave starts. You're gambling your roof on a theory of dirt." Thomas watched him leave, the carpenter's boots crunching on the dry needles. He respected Henderson's knowledge, but he knew the man was thinking of houses built on the flat plains of the east. Up here, everything was a gamble with the earth, and Thomas had simply decided to play a hand that the others hadn't even realized was on the table. By October, the pragmatic skeptics took their turn, represented by the local storekeeper, a man named Vance who viewed every human endeavor through the lens of a ledger. He stopped by with a delivery of salt and flour, looking at the massive pile of tailings Thomas had moved to the edge of the ravine. "The hours you've put into this hole, Thomas, you could have worked a claim or taken a job at the mill," Vance said, leaning against his mule. "You've spent for months of labor to save yourself the trouble of walking 10 yards to a woodshed. If you calculate the day wage of a laborer, that's the most expensive firewood in the territory. You could have bought 3 winters' worth of coal for the sweat you've poured into this dirt." Thomas looked at his hands, which were stained with the tannins of the oak and the grey dust of the shale. "Coal has to be hauled up the grade, Vance. And the mill can close, and the claim can go dry. But this wood is already here. I'm not paying for it with money I don't have, I'm paying for it with time I'd only spend staring at the wall." Vance shook his head, his mind already back on his accounts. "It's a poor man's economy, Thomas. You're trading your health for a convenience. When your back gives out from all that crawling and lifting, you'll find that a dry log is a cold comfort." Thomas didn't mention that his back felt stronger than it had in years, or that the methodical nature of the work had provided a clarity that no ledger could quantify. He simply accepted his supplies and watched Vance descend the trail. The final skeptic, a woman from the valley who made it her business to oversee the moral fiber of the settlement, didn't even get off her horse. She simply told him that hiding one's resources was a sign of a suspicious nature and that a good neighbor kept his wealth where it could be seen and, if necessary, shared. Thomas offered her a polite nod and went back to his work. He knew that social propriety was a luxury of the warm and the well-fed. The mountain had a much harsher set of rules, and they were about to be enforced. The first external stress test came in early November, a deceptive storm that began as a gentle rain and turned into a flash freeze within 3 hours. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees as a northern front collided with the moisture-heavy air of the valley. Down in the settlement, the wood piles that Miller had bragged about were soon encased in a 2-inch shell of clear, impenetrable ice. The rain had soaked into the bark before the freeze, and now every log was a frozen club that refused to split and hissed into a cloud of steam when placed on a fire. Thomas, however, sat in a cabin that was a steady 70 degrees. He didn't have to go outside with an ice pick or a torch, he simply lifted a small hatch he'd built into his floorboards, a detail he'd kept hidden from the neighbors, and reached down into the earth-worn darkness. The wood he pulled up was dusty, bone-dry, and felt warm to the touch, having been insulated by the very ground that was freezing solid outside. He wouldn't learn for weeks that Miller had lost 2 toes to frostbite that night trying to hack enough fuel for his stove, but Thomas felt the first stirrings of validation as he watched a single match turn a handful of shavings into a roaring blaze. The real test, however, came 3 weeks later. It was the long white, a blizzard that lasted for 6 days and dropped for feet of snow, followed by a wind that drifted the white powder up to the eaves of the houses. The valley was cut off, and the traditional woodsheds, mostly flimsy lean-tos, collapsed under the weight of the drifts. Men were forced to tunnel out of their front doors only to find their fuel buried under 6 feet of packed snow, their hands freezing as they dug blindly for anything that would burn. The major extreme test arrived on the 4th day of the blizzard when the wind reached a sustained 50 miles per hour, screaming through the gaps in the timber. Thomas's cabin groaned, but the extra weight of the wood stored beneath the floor acted like a ship's ballast, anchoring the structure against the gale. While his neighbors' houses shuddered and shifted on their foundations, Thomas's home felt rooted to the mountain. Then came the social reversal. A frantic pounding on his door revealed Miller's son, a boy of 19 who looked like a ghost wrapped in a frozen blanket. "Our wood is gone, Mr. Thomas," the boy sobbed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The shed went down and we can't find the pile. My father's feet are turning black and the stove is out." Thomas didn't hesitate, he didn't gloat, and he didn't remind the boy of his father's mockery. He moved the rug, opened the floor hatch, and began tossing logs up into the room. "Fill your sack," Thomas commanded, his voice muffled by the wind. The boy stared into the hole, his eyes widening as he saw the neat, dry rows of timber stretching back into the darkness. "It's dry," the boy whispered, touching a piece of cedar as if it were gold. "How is it dry?" Thomas just pointed to the hatch. "The earth doesn't freeze for feet down, son. Now get moving before the trail vanishes." Over the next 2 days, 3 more neighbors made the trek, guided by the smoke from Thomas's chimney, the only consistent plume on the ridge. They arrived as skeptics and left as believers, carrying the dry currency of survival on their backs. They saw the trenches, they saw the reinforced piers, and they saw the genius of a man who had looked at a wasted space and seen a sanctuary. The moral authority who had judged him was the last to come, her pride finally broken by the sight of her shivering children. Thomas gave her the same dry wood he gave the others, his silence a more powerful rebuke than any lecture. By the following spring, the community diffusion had begun in earnest. The sound of picks hitting shale echoed across the valley as men who had once mocked Thomas began to dig beneath their own homes. There were caveats, of course. Henderson was kept busy advising on structural reinforcements, and Vance started stocking specialized drainage tile, turning a profit on the very innovation he had called a poor man's economy. The Thomas cellar, as it came to be known, became a standard feature of the high country cabins, though few men had the patience to dig them as deep or as well as the original. Thomas watched the change with a wry, quiet satisfaction, sitting on his porch as the wild roses returned to the meadows. He had lost his wife and he had no heirs, but he had left a mark on the mountain that was more permanent than a name on a headstone. He had proven that tradition is often just a fancy word for a lack of imagination, and that the best solutions are usually hidden in plain sight, buried under the very floorboards we walk on every day. The generalized lesson he took from the experience was one he occasionally shared with the younger men who came to ask his advice: survival isn't about fighting the environment, it's about understanding its rhythms and finding the gaps where nature provides a shelter. He wouldn't learn for years that his design would eventually be studied by architects looking for ways to build sustainable homes, but for Thomas, the victory was simpler. It was the sound of a dry log catching fire on a cold night, the steady warmth of a house that refused to budge in a storm, and the knowledge that competence is the only true defense against a world that doesn't care if you live or die. Success, he realized, was not found in the approval of the valley, but in the methodical execution of a plan that turned a fool's errand into a legacy of warmth.